When I first got chickens, I thought I was just going to get a few hens. You know, something to give me eggs and eat the kitchen scraps. But what actually happened was much bigger than that. Those chickens revealed a whole system to me, because once you add chickens to the land, you start to see how everything connects. The soil, the plants, the insects, the decomposition. Suddenly, it's not separate projects anymore. It's one living system where each piece makes all the other pieces work better. And here's what I've learned after years of working with my hands in this soil. The best farming systems aren't complicated at all. They're actually radically simple. Today, I want to walk you through the 5 fundamental components that make my backyard farm work and how chickens fit into every single one of them. Let's start with the foundation of everything: soil and soil biology. Now, I know that might sound like the same thing, but there's actually a really important distinction here that I think is worth understanding. Soil, the actual soil itself, is made up of mineral components: the clay, the sand, the silt. That's the physical structure, the skeleton of the soil. And on its own, that's really just dirt. It's inert material. But when you add in all the biology, when you've got trillions upon trillions of microorganisms living and working and dying and decomposing in that mineral base, that's when you actually have soil, living soil. I like to think of it this way, and I've used this example before. You can take a teaspoon of healthy soil from the ground, and in that 1 teaspoon, you've got an entire little ecosystem. You can think of it like a tiny jungle or a savanna or a coral reef, all happening on that microscopic scale. It's kind of mind-boggling when you actually think about it. All of that biology, that's what drives nutrient cycling. That web of life in the soil is what makes all life on Earth possible, because plants can't just absorb nutrients directly from rocks and minerals. They need that biological community to break things down, to make nutrients available, to create the conditions where roots can actually take up what they need. And this is where the chickens come into this picture. When chickens scratch through the soil, when they're foraging and dust bathing and moving around, they're not just looking for food. They're actually aerating the soil, breaking up compaction, mixing organic matter into the top layers. Every time their feet hit the ground, they're creating tiny disturbances that allow air and water to penetrate deeper. And their poop? That's like rocket fuel for soil biology. Chicken poop is high in nitrogen, and when you get the carbon to nitrogen ratio right in your composting system, that nitrogen feeds explosive microbial growth. You're literally feeding the trillions of organisms that make your soil alive. So when I'm managing my gardens, I'm not really managing the plants. I'm managing the soil biology. I'm creating the conditions where that microscopic community can thrive. And chickens are one of the most powerful tools I have for building that biology year after year. Because when the biology is healthy, the soil structure improves. When the soil is healthy, the plants take care of themselves. Which brings us to plants. Plants are honestly pretty incredible when you start to understand what they're actually doing. They are quite literally the foundation for all life on Earth to continue. They make the oxygen we breathe. They draw carbon from the atmosphere, nitrogen too in the case of legumes, pulling it out of thin air and bringing it down to Earth to drive these biological systems we're talking about. But here's the thing I didn't fully understand when I first started growing food. I was thinking about plants as these separate individuals that I was growing. I'd plant a carrot, harvest the carrot, I'd pull out the whole plant and then start fresh. But what I've learned is that living plants form relationships with the soil biology. It's this intricate symbiotic process where the plant is feeding sugars down through its roots to fuel the microbial community, and in exchange, that community is breaking down nutrients and making them available to the plant. They improve each other's health. So now the way I manage each of my garden beds is as a little mini ecosystem where plants are constantly growing and decomposing back into the soil. I let weeds grow, I pull them out and lay them on the soil surface. I don't even worry about getting all the roots out because I actually want them to keep growing. Every growing plant is drawing carbon from the atmosphere and ultimately putting that carbon into the soil when it decomposes. Same thing when I'm harvesting crops. I only take away the piece we're going to eat. So with the carrots, I take the carrot and leave the green tops in the garden to decompose and put those nutrients back. And with my current experiment with the wool weed barriers, I tuck those pulled weeds and crop residues under the wool to break down. So far, it seems to be working okay. Now, when it comes to chickens and plants, this is where you need to be a bit strategic because chickens are incredibly helpful for managing plants in some contexts and absolutely destructive in others. In the off-season, or when I'm preparing a new garden bed, I'll let my flock into that area. They'll scratch through, eating the weed seeds, gobbling up insect eggs and larvae, working all that green material into the soil. It's like having a living tiller that also fertilizes as it works. But during the growing season, they need to be kept out of the beds. That's where good barriers and border management comes in. The chickens get to free range through most of the property, but the active garden areas are protected. Here's where it gets really interesting. From the perspective of building soil health, plants that remain in place for longer periods, potentially years, they develop much deeper, more extensive root systems. Those deep roots improve soil structure. They bring minerals up from deeper soil layers. They create channels for water and air movement. That's why I keep borders of alfalfa, fenugreek, or clover growing around the edges of the garden beds. It's why I often leave a section of my lawn pasture to grow to a much more mature stage than you'd normally keep grass. I don't mow it for weeks at a time over the summer. And what happens is those clovers and grasses put their roots deep down. They flower and set seed, and they create habitat for beneficial insects. This is what people mean when they talk about perennializing a system. You don't have to start from square one every year. You've already got this established ecosystem ready to support your chickens, beneficial insects, and whatever you want to grow. Let's talk about bugs. Plants need insects and insects need plants. It's not optional. It's fundamental to how these systems work. I know there's a whole industry built around killing insects in your garden, and I do understand the instinct. When you see something eating your crops, the immediate response is to make it stop. But here's what I've observed in my own system. When you have a diverse insect population, when you've got habitat for the beneficial predatory insects to live and breed, and healthy plants growing in healthy soil, you actually don't get pest problems, or at least not to a level that requires intervention. Because those predatory insects, the parasitic wasps and the ladybugs and all the rest, they're managing the pest populations for you. But they need somewhere to live. They need flowers for nectar and pollen. They need undisturbed areas where they can overwinter. That overgrown lawn I was talking about, that's providing massive amounts of insect habitat. All those flowering clovers and herbs, all that structural diversity in the grasses and weeds, that's supporting the beneficial insect community that helps to keep my whole backyard farm in balance. Chickens play a really important role in insect management. When I let the chickens into a garden bed in the off-season, they're scratching through the soil and eating the pest larvae, the beetles, the slugs and snails, all those things that would emerge in spring to attack my crops. By reducing those populations before they become a problem, the chickens are doing preventative pest management. Part of managing this system is just providing that habitat, letting some areas get a bit wild, not always tidying everything up, giving beneficial insects what they need to survive the winter and breed in the spring and summer, and using your chickens strategically to manage the pests without destroying the whole insect ecosystem. Okay, let's talk about livestock. And for me, with my little backyard farm, that means chickens. In a traditional regenerative agriculture system, you'd have large ruminants as your livestock. Cattle, sheep, goats. They co-evolved with grassland ecosystems, and when they're managed well, they're absolutely essential for building soil health. They graze the grass, they fertilize the soil, their hooves break up the surface, they stimulate plant growth. Grasslands with grazing animals are incredibly powerful ecosystems for storing carbon in the soil, for improving fertility over time. It's a perennial system, and those roots go deep, and the whole thing just gets healthier year after year when you get the management right. But obviously, most of us aren't running cattle on our land. So here's how I've adapted that principle to my much smaller scale. I maintain my lawn as a pasture. It's mostly perennial grasses and clovers, and yes, it has to live in relationship with my lawnmower. But that pasture produces a huge amount of biomass that feeds directly into my chicken system. And the chickens. Chickens are not ruminants, obviously. They're omnivores with completely different digestive systems, completely different behaviors. But in my integrated system, they're filling that livestock role. They're the animals that are cycling nutrients, concentrating fertility, driving the biological activity. Let me break down exactly how this works, because I think this is where chickens prove their value well beyond just egg production. First, nutrient cycling. Every bag of chicken feed I buy gets turned into eggs for my family and fertilizer for my gardens. That's 2 products from one input, and chicken manure is incredibly valuable for soil building. It's high in nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, plus some of the trace elements plants need. But unlike straight chemical fertilizer, chicken manure feeds the soil biology. Second, the scratching behavior. Chickens are constantly scratching through organic matter, turning it, aerating it, breaking it down. In my composting chicken run, they're doing the work of turning the compost, but they're also inoculating it with their manure, adding nitrogen, speeding up decomposition. What might take months to compost in a traditional heap happens in just weeks with the chickens working through it. Third, and this is something I didn't fully appreciate until I got my flock up to about 20 chickens, the sheer volume of material they process. These birds are eating grass, eating weeds, eating kitchen scraps, eating insects, eating garden waste. They're mobile nutrient concentrators. They're taking low-value biomass from all over the property and converting it into high-value eggs and manure. Now, flock size matters for this. When I had a normal person number of chickens, which was about 5, I was barely producing enough manure to make a difference to my garden fertility. At 20 plus chickens, I'm producing more compost than I can use. I'm building fertility year over year. The garden beds are getting richer, the soil biology is getting more diverse, and I'm reducing my dependence on purchased inputs. Breed selection matters too. If your primary goal is nutrient cycling and soil building, you want robust, dual-purpose heritage breeds. Chickens that can handle free-ranging, that have good foraging instincts, that can breed naturally if you want to maintain your own flock numbers. At this point, my flock is mostly mixed breeds with a fair amount of barred rock genetics in them, and they're fantastic for this kind of system. They're active foragers. They're heavy enough to do some serious soil tillage and some serious damage if I'm not careful. They go broody so I can raise chicks naturally, and they produce a fairly good number of eggs. And then there's the question of roosters. I've got 2 roosters in my flock, and I know that's not possible for everyone. But if you can keep roosters, they add this whole other dimension to the system. You can breed your own replacements, you're not dependent on buying chicks every few years, and you develop a flock that's adapted to your specific conditions. The roosters also change flock behavior. They're out there finding food, calling the hens over, keeping an eye out for predators. It's a more natural dynamic, and I think it makes for calmer, more confident chickens that are better at the foraging and pest management we're asking them to do. Managing the flock within the broader system requires some infrastructure. I've got the composting chicken run where they spend time working through organic matter. I've got the garden nets that keep them out of the active garden beds, and I can take those nets off one by one as the season ends or if I'm changing crops. It's that strategic access that makes the whole thing work. Chickens in the right place at the right time are incredibly valuable. Chickens in the wrong place at the wrong time will destroy everything you're trying to grow. But when you get it right, when you've got a robust flock of dual-purpose chickens cycling nutrients through your land, building your compost, managing your pest insects, providing eggs and potentially some meat, that's when you realize chickens aren't just livestock. They're the engine driving the whole fertility system. Which brings us to the final piece, decaying organic material. This is happening everywhere in the system. The weeds and crop residues breaking down directly on the garden beds, the grass clippings melting back into the pasture, leaves falling from trees and being drawn into the soil by earthworms. The largest concentrated area of decomposition happening here is in my composting chicken run. The run is where all the organic waste goes. Kitchen scraps, garden scraps, weeds, grass clippings, pruning from trees, old hay, wood chips, absolutely anything that will break down. Now, a traditional compost pile, you've got to turn it regularly, you've got to manage the moisture, you've got to get the carbon to nitrogen ratio exactly right. It's a lot of work. But in a composting chicken run, you just fill it up with plenty of wood chips and let the chickens get it done for you. They're scratching through it constantly, turning the material, mixing the fresh green stuff with the older brown stuff, aerating it, breaking up clumps. Every time they scratch, they're incorporating their manure, adding nitrogen and inoculating the whole coop pile with beneficial microorganisms from their gut. And what comes out of it after about 12 months is some of the best compost I've ever worked with. It's dark, it's crumbly, it's got this sweet, earthy smell. It's teeming with fungal networks, which is exactly what you want for growing vegetables. It's rich in both nutrients and biology. When I spread this compost on the gardens, I'm not just adding fertility, I'm inoculating the growing areas with the diverse microbial community that's been building in the chicken run. All those bacteria and fungi, earthworms and protozoa, they move into the garden soil and continue their work there. And here's what's really important about this. In an ecological farming system, there is no such thing as waste. Every single thing has value. Every single thing contributes to the ongoing movement of life through the system. That lettuce you didn't eat, that's carbon and nutrients going back into the cycle. Those weeds you pulled, same thing. The prunings from your fruit trees, the grass clippings from your lawn, the fallen leaves in autumn, it's all food for the biology. It's all building fertility for next year's crops. Everything that is alive gives itself in death to the continuation of life. And the chickens are facilitating that process. They're the activators, the inoculators, the turners and mixers that keep the cycle moving fast enough to be useful on a backyard farm scale. When you step back and look at it, these 5 components, they're not really separate at all. Soil biology needs plants to feed it. Plants need soil biology to access nutrients. Insects need plants for habitats. Plants need insects for pollination and pest control. Decomposition feeds the soil biology. The soil biology drives that decomposition. And chickens? They're woven through all of it, scratching the soil, managing the plants, controlling the pests, making the compost. They're not just one piece of the system. They're the thread connecting everything together. That's what I mean by radically simple. You're not managing 5 different things. You're managing one living system. And the more you work with it, the more it starts to manage itself. The biology does the work. The nutrients cycle. Your chickens get healthier because they're eating diverse forage. Your gardens get more productive because the soil is getting richer every year. You start to need less intervention, fewer purchased inputs, less worry about whether you're doing everything right, because the system is doing what living systems do naturally, which is thrive when you give them what they need. I think a lot of us get into backyard farming because we want more connection. Connection to our food, to the land, to natural rhythms we've lost touch with. And chickens, they're such a perfect entry point into that because they don't let you treat the land as separate pieces anymore. Once you've got a flock, you start to see how it all connects. The soil feeding the plants, feeding the insects, feeding the chickens, feeding the soil. It becomes this beautiful cycle, and your job isn't to control it or force it. Your job is just to observe it, support it, remove the barriers that prevent it from working the way it wants to work. That's what regenerative farming really is. It's not a set of techniques you apply, it's a way of seeing, a way of partnering with these living systems that have always been here, working away whether we notice them or not. So the next time you're watching your chickens scratch through the garden, or you're spreading compost or pulling weeds, try to see the whole picture. See how one action connects to everything else. See the cycle turning. Because that's when it stops feeling like work and starts feeling like partnership. And that's when the magic happens.